This is the Spycraft 101 podcast. Welcome to your clandestine classroom. This is episode number 192 of the Spycraft 101 podcast. I'm joined today by Trevor Barnes, a former senior reporter and producer for the British Broadcasting Corporation and retired attorney. If you're a longtime listener, you may remember Trevor from his first appearance here on the podcast for episode number 33, when we discussed his book Dead Doubles, The Extraordinary Worldwide Hunt for One of the Cold War's Most Notorious Spy Rings. That was the story of the infamous KGB Portland spy ring, which operated in England in the 1950s. I invited Trevor back onto the podcast to discuss another spy ring operating in the UK and throughout Europe, but one which was only just uncovered very recently. 6 Bulgarians were arrested as members of a ring operating at the behest of the Russian FSB and GRU. And unlike many similar cases in the past, 3 of these spies were tried publicly, which offered some amazing insights into modern espionage operations and techniques, as well as the pitfalls that led to their discovery and subsequent arrests. By the way, if you're looking for a way to get friends and family as interested in history as you are, or if you want to learn something new and unexpected every month, then make sure to check out History by Mail. Every month, History by Mail will send you reproductions of famous and influential historical documents from American history. Accompanying the documents themselves are articles which put them in the context of their times and help you understand the impact they had on the course of American life. The topics are widely varied, so you're always learning something new across themes that include historic inventions, American wars, and foreign diplomatic relations. I'm really enjoying my own subscription because it's opening my eyes to historic events I knew nothing about. You can subscribe for yourself or gift a subscription at historybymail.com for as little as $6.50 a month. Just click the link in the show notes of this episode and use the discount code JUSTIN10 for a permanent 10% off your subscription. Trevor, welcome back.
Hi.
Thank you for doing this again. It's honestly so rare for me to get the chance to discuss very recent events like this, so I was really happy when I unexpectedly found out that you were covering this story as it unfolded and that you would agree to come back on the podcast and share it with us.
Well, it's a pleasure, and the case we're going to talk about is absolutely fascinating. It'll bring your listeners up to date with what Moscow's operations in terms of espionage are doing currently in Europe.
That's so great, because that's a big question that I get so often from listeners and followers and that sort of thing is, tell us about what's happening now. And I don't have the ability to do that so often, but now finally this amazing opportunity has come through, at least for us, for the historians and the listeners, to find out what's happening. So as I understand it, you have this incredible opportunity because you've been attending the trial in person, correct?
Exactly right. Yeah, I mean, I was looking around for a new project, and was very interested in what's going on now. And of course, so rarely is it possible for someone to lift the lid and discover what's really going on in terms of Moscow's spy operations, and also the response of the West. So when I heard that there'd been an arrest of 5 Bulgarians in February 2023. Then I felt here was a great opportunity to, see how it happened and see if it came to trial. So I was following it from the beginning through the pre-trial hearings, which were all at the famous Central Criminal Court, the Old Bailey in London, right through to the actual trial itself, which ended at the beginning of March this year.
Yeah, I mean, breaking news practically, especially as far as this podcast is concerned. So I'm very curious, how were you able to attend the trial, like with journalistic credits, or did you have to apply to get in or something like that?
Well, I started off going actually to the first pre-trial hearing, sitting in the public gallery, because there's been a big move in Britain, quite rightly, to ensure that justice is open whenever possible. There's always a public gallery. But I discovered that when you went to the august oak-lined courtrooms at the Old Bailey, all built and opened at the beginning of the last century, you're miles away from the action. And a lot of people don't have on the floor of the courtroom any amplification, so it's quite hard to hear. And then in addition, you had video links with the prisons, because all of these prisoners were called category A prisoners, i.e. the biggest risk, because of course if you're accused of spying for Moscow, that's a very serious charge. And so you had video links, and you couldn't actually see the video links from the public gallery. So I realized I needed to get in. And so I used to work in my first career, as you said, at the BBC. And through various contacts, I was asked by the premier London newspaper called the London Standard, to be a correspondent for them in the courtroom and follow this case through. So that was how I got into the courtroom. And there's an immense difference, Justin, between being down in the well of the court, able to talk to the lawyers at breaks in the proceedings, to be next, if you like, to the defendant sitting in the glass-lined dock, from being up above in the gods, so to speak, with the members of the public who just don't have anywhere near the same access to contacts and people who know, the lawyers representing the defendants and others on the floor of the courtroom itself.
Very cool. That's so great that you were able to get in there and get that ground level view of it. So was this like every day were you in there? I mean, several hours every morning or something like that? Like, how much of your life did you have to kind of invest in this story?
Well, for the pre-trial hearings, it varied. I mean, what a lot of people don't realize is that when you get the big public trial at the end, there's been lots of preparation. And so I knew that of the final 6 Bulgarians who were arrested, there were endless pre-trial hearings and joustings between attorneys as to what evidence would be allowed in. There were questions of law. For example, why was Russia an enemy of Britain? Was Russia an enemy state? How could this be proved? And in fact, this was a point of law that went, even before the trial started, all the way up to the Court of Appeal for England and Wales to decide, yes, Russia is indeed an enemy. You didn't need to have evidence about that.
Oh, wow.
But importantly, by the time the trial began, 3 out of the 6 Bulgarians had pleaded guilty to espionage charges. The main charge was conspiracy to spy for Russia. And they pleaded, or 2 of the 3 pleaded guilty to that. The third one pleaded guilty just before the trial was about to begin to a lesser espionage charge. And that left 3 people in the dock facing trial. And the trial started rather later than originally anticipated because of these pre-trial hearings back in November of last year. So that was how much of my time was taken up with the pre-trial. With the actual case itself, when the trial began in courtroom number 7 in the Old Bailey, started, as I say, at the beginning of November. The court used to sit, in theory, start at 10 o'clock or 10:30, but because there were problems getting the defendants from the various high-security jails, they were to the dock. Very often there were delays, and they would normally finish at 4 o'clock. So I was in court pretty much every day. But in addition, there were quite a few delays because I don't know what it was like across in the United States, but there was a really bad outbreak of flu and various viral infections in Britain and in London in December, right over Christmas, and in January. And so a number of the jurors fell ill. And of course, if you've got 12 jurors and just one of them is ill and can't be there, you can't have a hearing.
Oh, wow.
Because all 12 jurors must hear all the evidence in order to reach a verdict. So the trial went right the way through, as I say, and ended in terms of the hearings at the end of February. And then there was a long delay before the jury actually reached a decision. So there was an element of tension while the reporters, including myself, were waiting for the decision on the 3 defendants. Were they or were they not guilty? And they were, in fact, all found guilty.
Okay. Yeah, I'm a little bit surprised. Well, I guess I should say I'm a lot surprised that this went to trial at all. So just from my own readings, I've never attended any trial, criminal or national security related. But typically what I've seen is that defendants here in the U.S., if they're actually charged with espionage related charges, almost always they tend to plead guilty for a reduced sentence. And there just are not that many trials, unfortunately, from the perspective of historians, of course. So was this also pretty unprecedented in recent times in the UK?
Yeah, it is, Justin. One of the reasons why I was interested in following it. I mean, there have been a few cases. There was an interesting one, for example, of a security guard called David Smith, a security guard at the British Embassy in Berlin. And he faced trial in London, but he pleaded guilty to 8 espionage charges. But there were, in fact, 3 days of hearings in the Old Bailey to, I think, explore his evidence. The judge says he was, I must say, one isn't surprised, said that he was a most unreliable witness, and he was sentenced to 13 years. But, I mean, he pleaded guilty. So it was different in this case because the three defendants all pleaded not guilty. So there had to be all the evidence that was adduced. And I was interested, and your listeners who might have possibly read my book, Dead Doubles, which was about the Portland spy trial, might find it interesting to make a comparison, because that was a case where it was held in the Old Bailey. And it was a case where all the five defendants in that case pleaded not guilty. So the evidence had to be led and produced in order to convince the jury, in that case back in 1961, as in this case in 2025, to show why these people were guilty. And clearly this poses really interesting questions for the intelligence agencies, for the justice departments, as to what evidence they feel they can reveal. And if there is very sensitive evidence, they might decide to have hearings behind closed doors. That didn't happen in this case, although one of the key witnesses was granted anonymity. We can talk a little bit, if you want, later about how this case was investigated, but that's pretty much the background. And cases like this where you could actually see the evidence, and there was an enormous amount, Justin, it was fascinating, that was produced before the evidence, are pretty rare.
Yeah, certainly seems that way. So it's a real treat from our perspective, no doubt about it. So let's talk about the Bulgarians themselves, if you don't mind. Can you start just with the ringleader and kind of run us through the members who were actually arrested in the end?
Yeah, so the arrests were made in two parts, really. On the 8th of February of 2023, 5 Bulgarians were arrested. The ringleader was a man called Orlin Roussev, a Bulgarian national who'd come to the UK and was granted settled status, and he was arrested in a dawn raid on an enormous former guest house on the eastern coast of England, in a county called Norfolk, in a town called Great Yarmouth. And when the police went in, they were just, and there were over 100 police officers involved in this operation to arrest these 5 people. They found the most enormous and fascinating array of sophisticated espionage equipment. So he was the ringleader. He didn't really have any particular cover or other job. But meanwhile, other officers down in London were arresting 4 other people. There was a man called Bizub Zambazov, and he was, if you like, the number 2 to Orlin Roussev. And he was in a relationship with a lady called Katrin Ivanova. And the two of them worked in a medical laboratory in London called the Doctor's Laboratory. That, if you like, was their cover. And they were both arrested at work. But when the police went into the apartment which they shared in North London, again, they found an array of counterfeit identity documents, other surveillance equipment, and so on and so forth. And then a man called Stoyanov, he was also arrested in London separately. And last but not least, there was a young woman called Vanya Gaberova, who was in her early 30s. And she was arrested at work as well. She operated a beauty parlour in West London called Pretty Woman. So they were arrested and they were all taken to a police station. And that was how that started. And I actually had the privilege of meeting someone who was actually in the police station at the night when they were arrested. And clearly it was a big operation. And it was difficult for the police because when they arrested these people, they found an enormous number of digital devices. I mean, if you actually look at the equipment which was found by the police, it's quite extraordinary. I mean, they found together 221 mobile phones.
Oh my gosh.
258 hard drives, 495 SIM cards, 33 audio recording devices, 55 visual recording devices, and an array of other very sophisticated equipment, including what were called IMSI grabbers. I can talk about those a bit later, which is a way of capturing details of mobile telephones. Anyway, the police had to somehow find a way of breaking into those digital devices to find out what was on them and see if they had evidence. And the trouble is that under the current laws in Britain, they've changed subsequently. The 5 defendants be held for 72 hours. But fortunately, the police had found all these counterfeit ID documents, so they were able to charge them and arrest them on the basis of those. The 6th person who was arrested was a man called Ivanchev, Tihomir Ivanchev, who worked as a painter and decorator in London. And he was arrested almost a year later in February 2024. And his arrest came about under somewhat interesting circumstances because he had been in a relationship with Vanya Gaberova. She was the woman who ran the beauty parlor, who I mentioned a moment ago. And then they'd split up. And when he heard on the Bulgarian London grapevine that something had happened and there'd been arrests, he turned up at Gaberova's flat on the evening of that arrest. And of course, there were police standing outside. And Ivanchev, gave his mobile phone number to the police, saying he'd come to check up on his former girlfriend, and suggested that she'd had some potentially suicidal episodes previously. And of course, the police could therefore contact him. And when he wanted to go back to Bulgaria a couple of months later, he was intercepted at the airport and his digital devices were taken from him for 48 hours and his mobile phone and he was then interviewed by the equivalent of the FBI called MI5 a couple of times. And clearly, when the authorities managed to start decrypting this absolute cornucopia of telegram and other messages that they found on the digital devices, they found material that also incriminated this last man number 6, Tihomir Ivanchev. And so that was the reason why he was arrested a year later.
Wow.
So that gives you a broad overview of the 6 Bulgarians who were arrested and at some point did all face trial.
My gosh. I'm still kind of stunned that he would give his phone number to a police officer standing outside his girlfriend's flat, but at the same time, it sounds like he would have eventually been implicated, so that may not have saved him anyway, I guess.
We don't know why Ivanchev gave his phone number over to the authorities, but he could well have been tracked by them in any event, but he did, and this enabled the security authorities to track him and therefore get hold of his devices. So what is interesting about Ivanchev is that he was the only one of the 6 when arrested who gave some cooperation to the police. The recorded interviews which he gave after his arrest in February 24, he gave a couple of recorded interviews to the police, were interesting because he revealed details of his 2 chats with people who he said were working for Britain's security service, MI5, the equivalent of the FBI. Mm-hmm. And he said, well, he did know these people who'd been arrested. He denied that he was involved in any spying, but did give the semblance of wanting to cooperate until after a couple of those interviews, he then said, just like the others, no comment any further, because obviously he didn't want to incriminate himself.
Of course. Maybe a little bit too late for that, unfortunately, but I understand why he would have realized how damaging it was. So, Trevor, I'm curious, did all 6 of these people, did they come to the UK intending to commit espionage? Were any of them recruited in place from the Bulgarian community, for example?
Well, it's a little bit murky. I mean, starting with Roussev, the one person we haven't mentioned is, if you like, the ultimate ringmaster of this spy ring was a man called Jan Marsalek, who everyone believes is currently in Moscow. Now, he floated like a ghost over all these operations. His name recurred again and again in these messages which I've just spoken about, because when the digital devices were decrypted, and although they were presented by Britain's Metropolitan Police anti-terrorist section called SO15, those of your listeners who know a bit about the way British espionage investigation and MI5 works, and also may have read my book, will know that there was for a long time a branch of the British police called Special Branch. Now, this was set up in the 19th century when you had the first outbreaks of terrorism from the island of Ireland against mainland Britain. They were called the Fenians. So the roots of Irish republicanism and the terrorism of the provisional IRA go back and went back a long, long way. So that was the origins of the Special Branch, and they became, over the period of last century, the police arm of the security service MI5. Because for a long while, MI5, and it still does, keep very much undercover, keep its operations secret. The only officer, the only person who is publicly named in Britain is the very head of MI5, a man called Ken McCullum. And for a long while, even the head of MI5 was not known. But McCullum now will give interviews, and he's seen. But MI5 generally is really, really behind the scenes. And so this case was fascinating to kind of work out what actually was MI5's role, and indeed of the security services, because, as I said, the face of this in the trial was of SO15 and Metropolitan Police. But there is no way that they had the ability to decrypt this enormous number of messages from these digital devices. And so I think it's almost certain that Britain's well-known equivalent of the NSA, National Security Agency, in the States, called GCHQ, there are code-breaking agency, there are interception of communications agency, and they're based in Cheltenham in the central western part of Britain. They were almost certainly involved in decrypting these enormous number of messages. And in it altogether, they've managed to crack about 200,000 of them. And no fewer than 80,000 were in evidence in this trial. They were in a big A3 folder. So you were sitting there at the desk with the other reporters, and you had to kind of flip this great, enormous pile of stuff through. And these messages, when they were decrypted, revealed that this spy ring had been involved with at least 6 operations. They were the main purpose of the prosecution evidence. And there were others that also emerged during the trial as well. So MI5 was there. MI6, our external security service, the one that James Bond allegedly belonged to, that wasn't involved because they didn't need to be. But what was interesting was that throughout the whole of the trial, MI5, who clearly played a key role in this case, didn't need to put their head above the parapet. Whereas your listeners who may have read their doubles will recall that MI5 actually needed to have evidence of the surveillance operation against the Portland spy ring people as part of the evidence to convince the jury. Now, in this case, the prosecution felt that they didn't need to put any of this evidence from MI5's involvement into the public arena, potentially in front of the jury, because they had all this enormous number of messages. They also found on the digital devices lots and lots of photographs. They were able to trace the financial transactions and the ways in which the members of the spy ring were paid. They were paid in Bitcoin and so on and so forth. So really, if you didn't know the way in which these counterintelligence operations today and in the recent past are put together, you would have no idea of their involvement. I mean, it's obvious, for example, that before you had this arrest of 5 Bulgarians at dawn on the 8th of February 2023, there had to have been an enormous and sophisticated surveillance operation run by a combination of MI5 and the police on the 5 Bulgarians, because you can't just go into a property and seize material without knowing the people are going to be there and where they're living. But none of that was given to the jury. It wasn't needed to be given to them in order to get a conviction.
Interesting. Did it come out during the trial what the origin of this investigation was? Because I've seen, in my opinion anyway, that's often kind of like the murkiest and most close hold aspect of any investigation is how it began.
You are absolutely right. That's one of the most important unanswered questions left after this case. What actually was the reason? What was behind the tip-off, if you like, the clue that actually put the British security authorities onto the spy ring? And we don't know. Now, a couple of possibilities. The most likely one is a tip-off from another intelligence agency. Well, it's got to bear in mind that following the invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, there was a mass expulsion of Russian legal spies. People who are listening to this and know about Russian espionage will know that Russian intelligence agencies have two types of spies. They have the legal ones, in inverted commas, who are operating as diplomats from Russian embassies. And then they have the illegals. These are the people who operate undercover. They adopt a completely false identity. And these were the type of spies that were at the heart of the Portland spy ring, as readers of Dead Doubles might recall. So a very, very sophisticated kind of thing had to go on in these sorts of cases.
Yeah, I would love to know the origin, but it seems unlikely at this point if everything else has come out like that.
Yeah, I mean, just to finish off that point, we don't know. A tip-off is most likely, and the point that is worth making is that following the invasion of Ukraine and the expulsion of the Russian diplomats, there was a lot more counterintelligence cooperation between intelligence agencies, particularly in Europe. They felt they needed to share the information. The other possibility is that they had somehow given themselves away, because one of the most important surveillance operations which this spy ring did was of an American air base in the south of Germany at a place called Stuttgart. It was called Patch Barracks. And in some ways, these spies engaged in surveillance, the Bulgarians, were pretty amateurish. And I thought that it was possible that they may have been picked up on the surveillance CCTV cameras around the exterior. But a friend of mine who used to work for the American government as a specialist in Russian intelligence and used to work for your intelligence community said that he thought that was highly unlikely because there is so much activity going on around Patch Barracks. And also because of various judicial constraints, the amount of material that can be collected without getting people's permission is actually limited by US laws. So it's highly likely, more likely, that somehow or other a friendly intelligence agency were put onto the track of these people and gave information to the British MI5 in the first instance in order for the spies to be put under surveillance.
Yeah, I can certainly see that happening. So, Trevor, I want to backtrack for a moment. You mentioned Jan Marsalek, and I've heard his name in the context of some completely different crimes. So he was kind of high profile to begin with. Can you talk a little bit more about him and his involvement with the Bulgarians?
Sure. I mean, Jan Marsalek is quite a character. He shot to fame, really, as chief operating officer of a German company called Wirecard, which dealt in basically payments and for rather dodgy companies. I mean, they were pornography companies, gambling companies, and it was enormously successful. But as European and other governments tightened up on money laundering and activities of that nature, more and more of the sort of activities of Wirecard became illegal. And Marsalek, who was an extremely able operator, I mean, he was a high school dropout, but very, very clever with technology, IT, also very, very good at convincing people of his case, sort of person who had a way with words. He would kind of, convince people that black was white and white was black. And he operated with a guy called Marcus Brown, who became the top guy. And this company became immensely powerful. It had a big stock exchange listing in Germany. But actually, it was built on sand, and a bit like a Ponzi scheme. And in June 2020, it collapsed, leaving debts of £1.6 million. So we're talking about, almost $2 billion. And it was discovered that Jan Marsalek, on the eve of the collapse, had been flown secretly out of Austria and had ended up in Moscow. There isn't 100% certainty about that, but It seems as though he has, due to investigations by the wonderful journalistic organisation Bellingcat.
Oh, yeah.
And he lives there under a number of identities, one of which is incredibly, Justin, that of a Russian Orthodox priest. But when he was at Wirecard, he had formed links with Russian intelligence, and in particular the GRU. And he used some of the money from Wirecard to actually journalists who were investigating Wirecard under surveillance. A lot of this activity was obviously illegal. And it's thought that this is how he formed a link with Orlin Roussev back in 2014, 2015. And this was what enabled and encouraged Roussev to set up this spy ring. So Marsalek is also linked with a whole lot of other activities. He suborned and got at least one agent within Austrian intelligence, the intelligence of Austria, to pass secret information to him. And some of this information was also shared with European intelligence agencies, including, according to some reports, Britain's MI6. He was also involved in setting up a private army in Syria. I mean, this guy had fingers in every single pie that you could imagine.
Wow.
And one of those pies was obviously running, at least one spy ring, the spy ring of these Bulgarians.
Man, that's incredible. Guy's a true criminal genius, it sounds like.
Yeah, I mean, he's subject to what's called an Interpol red notice, but he's not been arrested. And there are photographs of him. One was actually produced at the trial of him in military outfit. Huh. He loved boasting. He was this man who was, and still is, who likes to show off. But it also means it's very hard to take everything he says seriously. And he was, in fact, named, first of all, on the charge sheet for these Bulgarians, Jan Marsalek. But he was never arrested. He could never face trial. And in fact, interestingly, when 2 of the 6 Bulgarians pleaded guilty to conspiracy to spy, a condition of them agreeing to plead guilty was that they did not agree to say that they knew the person they were dealing with in Moscow was Jan Marsalek. Huh. Because in all these 80,000 odd telegram messages that were decrypted and produced in evidence, the person in Moscow was known by a code name of Rupert Titch. So the 2 people who pleaded guilty said, we pleaded guilty to conspiracy to spy for Russia, but we felt we were dealing with this mysterious person called Rupert Titch. Whereas everyone in the courtroom knows, the security agencies know, the police know that in fact it was Jan Marsalek.
Oh man, incredible. He's, like you said, a ghost floating over the whole thing.
Yeah.
So you mentioned Bellingcat a moment ago, and that reminded me that one of their operations was actually targeting a specific Bellingcat journalist, right?
Absolutely. And a man, Bulgarian, called Christo Grozev, who speaks fluent Russian and obviously Bulgarian. He helped set up the Bellingcat International Investigative Journalism Organization, particularly focusing on Vladimir Putin's Russia. And he's been a target for Russia for quite some time because he is most famous for 2 bits of investigative journalism really involving Russia. One was related to the appalling Novichok nerve agent poisoning in Salisbury, England, of a former GRU, so Russian military intelligence officer called Sergei Skripal. And he became an agent of the British intelligence services. And he was quite an important agent as far as we can work out. And he was, however, found out by the Russians, tried, locked up, and he was then swapped as part of the Operation Ghost Story 2010 swap of Russian illegals in Russia. So he came to the UK and lived in the beautiful cathedral town of Salisbury down in south of London. And he then was subject to this appalling attack with the nerve agent Novichok. Fortunately, he didn't die, nor did his daughter. But there was one woman who picked up a perfume bottle in which the Novichok had been kept, and she did die. And the investigation by Bellingcat revealed that this was this whole operation was carried out by some agents of Soviet military intelligence, and they found out their names, their backgrounds, and this was highly embarrassing for the Kremlin. The second operation, which Christo Grozev investigated brilliantly, was the attack on Alexei Navalny in 2020. He was the famous Russian dissident who ended up dying relatively recently, almost certainly in effect murdered in a Russian penal colony. And he had been, Navalny, the subject of the attention of the Kremlin for a while. And he had Novichok, the nerve agent, smeared on the inside of his underpants by FSB agents. And amazingly, Christo Grozev and his colleagues at Bellingcat uncovered this activity. And even more remarkably, they actually got the phone number of the FSB person responsible and knowing about this operation. And Grozev and Navalny actually rang him up and he answered the phone. They first of all began to pretend that they were the FSB superiors of this guy. So, I mean, clearly he was the sort of person who was causing a lot of severe headaches and embarrassment for the Kremlin. Mm-hmm. And so they've been on his track for quite a time. So one of the people who was subject of the surveillance of this team was Christo Grozev. What the Telegram messages recorded and documented was the fact that the team of Bulgarians in London were activated by Marsalek to go off to Vienna to stake out the Grozev's flat and where his father lived. Also, Grozev was attending in Spain an international conference all about investigative journalism, and so the team went over there and he was followed. Now, there was talk by Jan Marsalek and Orlin Roussev about assassinations at various points, including potentially of Grozev, but clearly that didn't happen. But the importance of this surveillance information is when it gets in the hands of people like the Kremlin and their special services who engage in what they call black operations, which can include assassination, then this surveillance information can suddenly become lethal. And this is what happened to Christo Grozev. And in fact, he, as a result of warnings about possible attacks, moved to the US, moved to New York. And in February 2023, just before this gang was arrested, he was warned by the FBI not to go back to Europe. He had a flight booked, and he was told that a team was waiting for him in Europe. And so very sensibly, he decided not to go. Mm-hmm. What it does is just illustrate the reach, the tentacles, and the concern that Kremlin has with, and Vladimir Putin has with, people who question his authority and pose a potential threat to the autocracy in Russia.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, if I remember correctly, Trevor, correct me if I'm wrong, there is a photo, like maybe it was Vanya, she took a photo of Grozev, like from behind, like he's sitting in a seat on an airplane or a passenger train, and she was seated near him and took a photo of him. Is that correct?
Well, that's exactly right. It was that particular operation, because they varied who was actually involved with each of the individual operations. Mm-hmm. So the first one, which is against Grozev, involved a certain number of the gang, and in fact, it was, I've got the details here in front of me. This involved, because they moved it to Spain, as I said. This involved Roussev himself, Zambarzov, Ivanova, Gaberova, and Ivanchev. And as one of the things that emerged during the trial was the ability of this gang to basically pay people in positions where you would expect them to behave properly to pass over information of assistance. So there was one particular woman who was referred to in the Telegram chats as Svetka or Sveti, and she worked for an airline company, and she was providing real-time travel information to the gang about Christoph Grozev's movements, and also those of another Russian journalist called Dobrokotov, who runs a dissident newspaper called The Insider, Roman Dobrokotov. And this woman was subsequently tracked down by the BBC after the verdicts. Her real name is Svetlana Gencheva. And you could see in these telegram messages how she was passing the information to the gang about seat numbers, for example, where Grozev would be sitting, so that when they got Ivanova and Gaberova onto the flight, they could sit very close to him. And Gaberova was wearing, as you say, spy spectacles, so she could take a photograph. And, they passing information live in real time back to Roussev, and then potentially back to Marsalek in Moscow. So that's a very good illustration of the sophistication of their surveillance operations, Justin.
Yeah, totally. A photo like that is so innocuous on the surface, but it's incredibly chilling to understand the implications of that. That a person behind you is literally plotting your murder.
Well, if we imagine we were going on a flight and we had that information about us, and I'm sure your listeners will feel exactly the same. This great sense of, well, who do you trust anymore when you just take a flight? And if you're someone like Grozev or Dobrokotov, who clearly is in the sights of the Kremlin, then it really does pose some very serious and important questions about how secure these systems, the systems called Amadeus is the one where you get all this flight information, how secure that is, such that passengers can feel safe.
Yeah, that's increasingly hard to do in these digital era. We all have a footprint that we're creating, and it certainly helps to have somebody on the inside of the airline who's willing to betray that immediately. So I have to assume that Christoph, even before this happened, he knew that he was very high profile with the Russian government. He knew exactly what they were capable of course. But, I don't understand how you can really sleep at night after that, knowing that there are a team of pretty competent people out there who are out to get you and who can get very close to you without you realizing.
Well, yeah. I mean, there are, as I said, a number of sort of puzzles and unanswered questions from the evidence. I mean, there was evidence in the telegram messages that the gang said that they stole a laptop from Christo Grozev from his apartment when he was staying in Montenegro, and that this was then smuggled to Moscow. But Christo Grozev was interviewed by the British police, and he said he did not recall ever losing or having a laptop stolen, which seems very, very puzzling, because someone like him, whose life is, potentially at risk all of the time, the information he carries is very, very sensitive, and he will certainly encode it and put it on digital devices. You'd have thought he would be very, very careful of his digital devices and be very aware if any of them went missing. So, one wonders again, was the gang lying? Were they incompetent and took the wrong laptop? Or possibly, one has to say, did Christo Grozev, for whatever reason, is he not as careful of his digital devices as one would think he might be?
Yeah.
Or indeed, did he, for whatever reason, I'm not accusing him of lying, of course, give some sort of misleading statement to the British police, possibly to mislead the Russians? I mean, one will never know.
Yeah, very interesting. There's just layers within layers with all of the stuff. You mentioned earlier Tihomir, and I had forgotten, actually, for a little while, but there was some, I don't know if it's called a rumor or a question, rather, that he might have had some sort of relationship with MI5 as well. Did that come up at the trial at all?
Well, there was evidence, because Ivanchev said he had 2 meetings, or at least 2 meetings, with a person who said he was from MI5. Now, MI5 has a policy of neither confirming nor denying meetings of this nature. And one can understand why, because, they obviously trying to keep a low profile. My view as someone who's taken interest in this is, frankly, if MI5 did not follow up and interview Ivanchev, it would not have been doing his job properly.
Right.
So I'm convinced that there was some form of meeting where Ivanchev spoke to the security service, and somewhere in the headquarters of the security service in what's called Thames House, there will be some notes, contemporaneous notes of what Ivanchev said. But as I said earlier, there is no evidence at all, other than those few mentions in Ivanchev's evidence of MI5's role, And clearly, as I say, it was significant and important. But exactly what happened and exactly what MI5 did and when, we'll have to wait for quite a long time to find out, unless Thames House, which I think quite rightly will be celebrating the verdict of this trial. I'm sure that when the verdict came out, there was a bottle of chilled white wine or elderflower cordial, depending on whether people are teetotal, to celebrate the successful conviction of these 6 Bulgarians, because it was a very, very important case for the security service and for the Metropolitan Police. So one hopes that over the coming weeks and months, possibly a few more details might be vouchsafed to journalists or historians and others who wish to really kind of celebrate, I think, what was an amazingly successful operation by the British security services.
Absolutely agree. And, I have to comment on Ivanchev. Whatever the level of cooperation was from him, it obviously was not enough to prevent him from being arrested and prosecuted and convicted. So he cannot have been one of their number one guys, I have to assume, if they're willing to sacrifice him to that level. I assume he didn't testify against the others or anything like that.
No. I mean, he was the only one of the 3 who did not go into the witness box.
Okay.
I mean, we'll never know exactly. There were clearly fascinating tensions between the 3 because of the interlocking relationships, sexual relationships between
right
4 of the arrested people. Ivanchev, I think, was pretty clearly the most junior, if you like, and he came across as rather sort of innocent. I mean, he formed a long-term relationship with Gaberova. He helped her. He was also a carpenter. He was also a championship-level open water swimmer, and he came across in the evidence that we did hear as being a bit of a nice guy. Coming around to her flat after she's been arrested to check up on her, and he helped her set up her beauty parlor. He obviously felt that they were in a longer-term relationship. But Gaberova gave evidence that they started to drift apart, and Ivanchev, I think, was pretty resentful at some of the evidence that Gaberova alleged against him. Some of it's quite petty. I mean, she said one of the reasons why she fell out with him was that Ivanchev, said that her backside was too big. I mean, this is the sort of stuff that got the jury. Oh, wow. Kind of laugh. And equally well, I think Ivanchev was pretty upset when the evidence emerged about Gaberova starting a sexual relationship with Zambazov, and even more so when Gaberova gave evidence that just before Christmas and the arrest, they had a major falling out, and she was fed up with Zambazov, who was faking that he had fatal lethal cancer, faking this with her, and yet on the morning of the arrest of Gaberova and Zambazov at Gaberova's flat, Zambazov was found naked in her bed with her when the police came in at 6 o'clock in the morning. So it really reads like some rather tacky love interest novel, sort of Jackie Collins, bodice ripper, than a spy story. It really does sort of make your mind boggle, Justin, about what happened.
Totally does. And I believe that there was sort of like a love triangle situation with Ivanova as well. I don't recall the details if there was.
Well, I mean, insofar as we could untangle it when we were watching the evidence, Ivanova, who came across as a very cool customer, she just stuck with her defense line, wouldn't be budged. The first great question, actually, from the prosecuting attorney was, "Miss Ivanova, you're a very good actress, aren't you?" Which is a pretty good opening question, because whatever you say is, can be taken the wrong way. Yeah, no, she had been in a long-term relationship with Zambazov when she met through acquaintances at the Bulgarian embassy when they first arrived in the UK, and she had stuck with him, and she had clearly been involved and knew exactly what was going on, but she pretended she didn't.
Okay.
I mean, and it just begged belief, quite frankly. There was so much evidence of them being at locations together, Patch Barracks, living together in the same flat, same apartments for quite a long time. then the fact that there was evidence that she had got involved with collecting the equipment together to go off to the American air base down in Stuttgart.
Mm-hmm.
In particular, there was this amazing piece of equipment I called the IMSI grabber, which was analysed by British experts, technology experts, and it's a very sophisticated bit of equipment which in effect replicates what a mobile phone mast can do in terms of collecting the data of the mobile phones in the immediate area. And Marsalek in Moscow said that Russian intelligence believed that Ukrainian armed forces were sending soldiers to be trained at the Patch Barracks in the use of Patriot missiles. You and your listeners will recall that these are the incredibly effective anti-aircraft missiles that, given, loaned, or whatever, by the US to Ukraine to defend itself against Russian attacks. But of course, sophisticated equipment needs sophisticated training. And the plot seems to have been that this spying was going to go to the perimeters of the barracks, and then they would switch on the IMSI grabber, which would receive information about the mobile phones belonging to these Ukrainians, so they could get their numbers of these people, so that when they went back to Ukraine and were deployed using the Patriot missiles, the Russians would of course know pretty clearly where these missiles were.
Yeah.
And they'd just be able to launch some direct attacks against them and take these missiles out and kill the trained Ukrainians at the same time. That seems to have been the plot. But of course, no one's confessed to what the plan was. The only one who really knew the full details was Jan Marsalek, the fugitive from justice in Moscow.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's very clever. I have to give you credit.
But Ivanova had been, I say, in a long-term relationship with Zambarzov, and then what happened was that, and Ivanchev had been in the relationship with Gaberova, and then on one of their surveillance jaunts in Montenegro, Zambarzov, who by all accounts was very good at chatting up women and was quite energetic and extrovert and liked to spend money and buy gifts and have a good time, convinced Gaberova that he was a better prospect than Ivanchev, and so they started their sexual relationship then. So, as I said, Zambarzov was found round at Gaberova's flat on the morning they were arrested.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's all very scandalous. Of course, do you think that this had an actual impact on their operations? Like, was the ring falling apart because of these relationship dynamics, or did they kind of keep it professional despite this stuff?
I think they kept it pretty professional. I mean, Ivanova, who said that she, in the witness box, that the news of this sexual relationship between Zambarzov and Gaberova was completely new, and she was shocked. It came out in evidence that it was a pretty open relationship, and that she had had affairs with other men as well.
Oh gosh!
So, and Zambarzov, although we were not given details, seemed to have been very successful at forming relationships with the opposite sex. So I think there was quite a lot of acting that was going on. The person who one got the impression who may have been most affected by it and was pretty fed up about the whole thing was Tihomir Ivanchev, the painter and decorator who, as I said, cooperated with the British police and MI5 a little bit at the beginning. And he'd been sort of led into this spy ring by Gaberova. And he told the police when he was first arrested that he was perfectly happy and everything else. And then he said, until I met Vanya Gaberova, and then and he said, used the F word, she effed up my life. So it was some pretty direct language, which sounded quite credible, actually. There's a bit of evidence that did actually sound truthful.
Wow. Amazing stuff. And it seems like it should be very obvious that you don't get involved with people you work with, but that happens every day all over the world. So why wouldn't it also happen in a spy ring, full of tension and risk and dynamism and all that? I can understand, I guess, how it would happen in the long term.
Yeah, and I think the dynamic between Gaberova and Zambarzov was that Gaberova, I think she was, in the old phrase, a good time girl. She obviously liked the good life, going shopping in malls and buying and receiving quite expensive gifts. And Ivanchev just wasn't, that's my reading, just wasn't glamorous enough and successful enough and earning enough to retain her long-term affections. Ivanova, I think, had known Zambarzov much, much longer, and it was a relationship of knowledge of the other person. But there's no evidence, to go back to your main point, that any of this caused the spying to fall apart. And there's no evidence either that any of the spying had gone to the authorities and had given them details. They certainly did not give themselves away. And one of the intriguing points is how, in many ways, amateurish they were. I mean, they were convicted on the basis of all the evidence which they had on their own digital devices.
Mm-hmm.
And I find it astounding. There was only, in all of the 80,000 odd messages, of one from Gaberova to Ivanchev saying, "Did you delete our chat?" And, if you're aspiring, one of the first things you do is try and cover up your traces. You want to leave the minimal amount of evidence that if you are caught, you can be prosecuted successfully.
Mm-hmm.
You try and leave as few traces as possible.
Mm-hmm. So that's such a huge question for me, Trevor. Were they truly not setting these messages to auto delete or anything? I thought that was a feature on many apps and presumably on Telegram. I don't actually use Telegram, so I don't really know the features. But I mean, why in the world would you keep 80,000 messages about your activities streaming back months and months?
Another of the great unanswered questions. I mean, if you, I mean, of course, the intelligence agencies, national security agencies, Britain's GCHQ have the most sophisticated means of retrieving a lot of stuff. So the stuff something's on auto delete doesn't mean it disappears from the universe. There are ways that there may well be a trace somewhere, and this can be not only retrieved but encrypted. Obviously, messages are also material put on the cloud. So, it is surprising, and clearly, when they were put under surveillance, which, as I say, must have happened for a period before the arrests on the 8th of February 2023, they clearly didn't spot it.
Mm-hmm.
Mind you, the level and sophistication of surveillance operations run today, whether by FBI, CIA, or the British equivalents, is much, much higher than it was back in 1960 and 61 when the Portland spy ring were being tailed by the Watchers, as they were called. So, I mean, but again, really well-trained intelligence officers are very, very carefully schooled in ensuring that they do keep an eye out for obvious surveillance. Anyway, the spy ring clearly weren't prepared, didn't get rid of the evidence in the way they could, and I say they were kind of convicted on the basis of the material that they had.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm very curious. Maybe that's all that they were doing was just like, swiping left and deleting, every day or two or something like that. And maybe that's simply not enough to overcome the, collection and retention capabilities that British government had on hand. So that's possible that they exercised some discipline. It just wasn't enough. I don't know. But
well, I mean, there were these 6 operations, the Grozev surveillance operation. There were operations as well, surveillance operations against other people. I mean, they were all surveillance operations of different types. So there was one against a Kazakhstan national called Sergei Raskaliev. There was a slightly different operation against the Kazakh embassy in London. Strange plan seemed to have been to stage a fake demonstration outside the London embassy to create a pretense that the spy ring and Masalik were in possession of genuine intelligence about those responsible, which they'd then passed to Kazakh intelligence to kind of curry favour with them. I mean, it's very bizarre and complicated operation, which may have been linked, according to a source I know, to the fact that the Russians were very keen to get a defector back into Russia who was being held in Kazakhstan, but we don't know. Then there was the Patch Barracks surveillance in Stuttgart, which never actually took full fruition because, and this is another mystery or coincidence, that the arrests on the 8th of February 2023 were on the very day that the spy ring were going to go over to Patch Barracks and deploy that sophisticated bit of equipment called the IMSI grabber to get the details of the mobile phones of these Ukrainian soldiers. And the arrest took place on the day they were due to go, but the London police involved deny that there was a direct link and that the arrests took place in order to ensure that operation was thwarted. Mm-hmm. And then the last operation was against a man called Kirill Katcher. He was a Russian national who was a bit of an enemy of Putin because he'd been employed by the investigative committee of Russia. But he left the country in 2021, and then he was designated as a foreign agent by Russia. In other words, they wanted him back to stop him causing problems for them. Kirill Katcher was put under surveillance in Montenegro. So sophisticated operations, but looking at the importance of this spy ring, it's really an interesting issue to put it into perspective, because in many ways their tradecraft was pretty amateurish. Grozev wasn't very good at flying a drone, for example, so he crashed it into the sea in Montenegro.
Oh, wow.
They made some other errors. In some ways, it was a bit like Johnny English or Keystone Cop Spies rather than James Bond. Mm-hmm. But on the other hand, as we were saying earlier about Christo Grozev and also this guy Kirill Katcher, there's evidence that this material back in Moscow's hands could have been used for murder, for assassination. So, mm-hmm. I mean, it was a serious operation, and clearly there was quite a lot of money that was passed over to the spy ring, hundreds of thousands of euros. And some of the equipment was very expensive. I mean, this IMSI grabber to collect this mobile stuff, there was hidden away in the files of evidence was a receipt for it, costing about $400,000 or $500,000.
Oh my gosh!
And the location of the receipt, the company provided it, was, wait for it, in Moscow.
Huh.
But the British experts who looked at it said it had been sort of made to measure and altered, probably by Roussev, and may well originally have been made in China.
Oh wow!
So I mean, there are, as you were saying earlier, there are kind of wheels within wheels, rings within rings. In its own way, it's a bit like one of those famous Russian dolls, Justin. You take one bit off and there's another doll in the middle and mm-hmm. another mystery and another revelation. Mm-hmm. Fascinating.
It really is. Trevor, I'm very curious with this obvious mountain of evidence against them. Why do you think that three of them chose to plead not guilty? I mean, did they think that they had any chance of skating out of these charges in the end? I mean, what was their defense?
Well, their defense was essentially what was their state of mind, Justin, because the issue was not whether there was a conspiracy to spy. Clearly, the evidence was there. These 80,000 messages, the photos, the location details of these people outside the Kazakh embassy. Altogether, there clearly was a conspiracy, plus the fact that 2 out of the 6 people had pleaded guilty to a conspiracy.
Right.
So from a legal point of view, those 2 guilty pleas were adduced as evidence. So there was a conspiracy. The issue was, and the defense was, the 3 people said, we didn't know we were spying for Russia. For an enemy state. We were doing it essentially for this guy, Roussev, or the woman was saying we were doing it for this sweet-talking man, Zambazov, and we were doing it for the money. That was the issue. They were saying, oh, well, Ivanova would say, well, yes, I did share a flat with Zambazov, but I never was any of the meetings when they talked about these sophisticated things. I had no knowledge that these enormous number of counterfeit documents were locked in the little safe in the flat, or were on the side of the bed where Boris Zambazov slept. I didn't know this stuff. I was just innocent. But that was their defense. But the jury understandably didn't buy into that defense. And Gaberova was particularly pathetic in saying, she was traveling around with Zambazov in Montenegro and elsewhere having a good time. And, I was wearing spy glasses, and there were photographs that were sent back to Roussev in London showing that we had surveillance. I just did what I was told. And also a couple of the women, Ivanova and Gaberova, said, we believed Zambazov when he said that he was actually an agent for Interpol. Because Zambazov did have some fake ID for Interpol, which apparently wasn't very good. But the woman said, he said he was working for Interpol, and that he was, for example, putting Christo Grozev under surveillance because there's a lot of corruption in Bulgaria and a lot of bad people in Bulgaria, and Christo Grozev was linked to them. So this was the kind of story that they embroidered and they put forward in the witness box, and the jury didn't believe it.
Yeah, it's pretty flimsy is what it sounds like to me. Maybe they were more convincing on the stand or something, I don't know, but it doesn't really pass the smell test for me.
Not that convincing. But there were parts. I mean, I have sat on a jury a couple of times, and I occasionally, and I have no knowledge, of course, at all of what the jury deliberations in this case were, but I kept thinking what my mind would have been if I'd been a juror. And I certainly was not convinced by Ivanova. There was so much evidence living with Zambazov and that sort of thing. But I did think it was just about possible that some jurors might have believed certain elements of Ivanchev's evidence and Gaberova's, but they didn't, and quite rightly so. And the verdict is there, and so we now await the sentencing of the 6 defendants, or 6 guilty parties, and that will be known in early May.
Yeah, so as we're recording this, right, we still have not found out the sentencing. Do you think that, or do you have an idea as to what they might be sentenced to? I mean, is there a typical range for this kind of stuff?
Well, the UK recently passed a new National Security Act to try and give the security authorities more investigative powers and leverage, and also to increase the penalties, and also to introduce legislation similar to that you have in the United States, as I understand it, to say that people who are in fact operating on behalf of a foreign entity have to register. So that came in. And also under the new legislation, it's possible for the police to hold people in cells for longer while investigations continue before they have to be released. And also the sentences are longer. My understanding is that the maximum sentence that these people can get is 14 years in prison. And I have a feeling in my waters, as they say, and I'm still a qualified UK attorney, that bearing in mind what's going on internationally, the perceived threat from Russia, the fact that all 6 of these people were found guilty, 3 of them pleaded guilty, that the British authorities and judiciary, and bearing in mind that, as I say, this was a sophisticated operation run from Moscow, and that they've been found guilty of knowing that they were helping Moscow at a time when you got the invasion of Ukraine and the dreadful, Ukraine is facing potentially being overwhelmed and being subsumed back into Russia again. So it's fighting for its existence at the moment. In these sort of circumstances, and the fact that MI5 has regularly talked about the threats from Russia, and there is another criminal trial coming in June involving Russian intelligence and the Wagner Group, that I think these sentences are likely to be, particularly for Roussev, right up there towards the top end of, 10 to 14 years for Roussev. And I think because 3 of the defendants pleaded not guilty and they had to go through the whole trial rather than plead guilty, that will push up their sentences. So I've got a feeling the sentences will be pretty severe.
Okay. Yeah, that's kind of what I anticipated to hear. And I take it that the original 3 that pleaded guilty are still waiting sentences after the termination of the trials. Is that right?
Exactly, yeah. So you've got
right.
Orlin Roussev, Zabazov, and Stoyanov. Once they pleaded guilty, they knew they weren't going to stand trial, and they will be sentenced. There'll be hearings at the Old Bailey in mitigation between the 7th and the 12th of May, and then the judge, Mr. Justice Hilliard, will announce the sentences.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, they'll be awaiting their fate. But one interesting question is I think we all know the answer, is whether the Russians would consider involving any of these people in a spy swap. And the answer is no.
Oh, wow.
Because
really?
None of them were officers. They were not fully fledged and trained agents of the Russian intelligence services, like Konon Molody, otherwise known as Gordon Lonsdale, or the Morris and Lona Cohen, the 3 out of the 5 spies in the Portland spy ring, who were both swapped. There was spy exchanges in the 1960s. This sort of operation is a quite more and more common one for Russia now, where they're outsourcing their surveillance spying. 10, 20 years ago, the surveillance spying would have been done by legal spies from their embassies or carefully trained freelance operators that the Russians dealt with directly. They wouldn't just be people who they've just been recruited via an intermediary, in this case, Jan Marsalek. So the Russians would say, back in Moscow, these people got their money. They were helpful as long as they operated and gave us useful intelligence. They got found out. We don't know why, but they're cut free.
Yeah.
They'll turn the page in Moscow and they'll go on to because there will be other groups of people like this around Europe. I had a brief chat with the charming man who's head of the Federal Intelligence Service in Switzerland recently, and on the fringes of a seminar, and he said there will be a whole load of other people run by the Russians, other teams like this across Europe. We don't know how many, we don't know what they're doing, but you can be sure that this spy ring is just one of several, if not many.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's no surprise there, I suppose. I am kind of a little bit shocked, I have to admit, that there's no chance that they'll be traded back, in your opinion. But, quite frankly, that's why you use these proxies, because they are, they're a little more expendable. Yeah, exactly. So unfortunate for them. That's a pretty common thread, though, is that the cases that I wind up talking about are the ones that went wrong, and usually it goes very badly for the people on the ground when it does go wrong. So that's what happens. That's the risk that you take if you're going to take part in these activities, no doubt about it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Wow. Trevor, this has been really fascinating. And of course, I love Dead Doubles. I loved it enough to talk to you about it 3 years ago. Are you working on another book right now, or do you have any major projects going on now that the trial's concluded?
Well, in the short term, my project is to follow up on this amazing spy trial. And I also intend to cover in a similar way the forthcoming trial of a man called Dylan Earle and others who were involved in setting fire, an arson attack on a warehouse belonging to a Ukrainian businessman in the east of London. And the prosecution says that it was the Wagner Group that commissioned them to do this, but the Wagner Group is an arm of the Russian state.
Mm-hmm.
That's going to be a fascinating trial due to start in June. So I might pull this stuff together into a book project, and I've got various other ideas, but nothing is formulated at the moment. I was more than happy to follow this amazing trial, and as I say, all the tentacles and associations and background connected with it have not yet been revealed. Hopefully, more will emerge in the coming months.
Yeah, hopefully so. It's interesting. But I have to say that I've said that so many times about so many different cases. Hopefully one day more emerges, and sometimes it does, and sometimes it does not, unfortunately. But yeah, this has been a very exciting one, no doubt about it.
Yeah, no. I've also been looking at the amazing new documents about the Cambridge 5 that have been released into the National Archives in the UK. So new documents about Kim Philby and about Anthony Blunt and about the least well-known of the Cambridge 5 spies, John Cairncross, have been released into the archive. And I've been looking at those and wrote an article for the Evening Standard about that. And the stuff, particularly related to Kim Philby, is fascinating. None of it is ground-shakingly new, Justin, but it just puts so much more flesh on the bones and corrects certain factual errors that very good authors like Ben McIntyre, who wrote the very good Life of Kim Philby, Spy Among Friends, wrote. He didn't have access to these documents, so he relied on what the information he had. And we can finally see, for example, exactly what the partial confession was, which Philby gave to the MI6 man Nicholas Elliott in Beirut.
Oh, wow.
Just before he defected to Moscow in January 1963. So actually seeing these documents, a document typed out by Kim Philby himself saying this is my confession is pretty remarkable.
Amazing stuff. Fascinating. Very cool, Trevor. Sounds like you're staying busy as always. Do you have like a website or social media pages or anything you can share with the listeners so they can follow?
Well, I've got a website, but it's not related to my work. But I'm on LinkedIn. I still occasionally tweet, but I'm less of a fan of X, as it's now called, than I used to be. But the best bet is to use LinkedIn.
Yeah, that's where I found your article a couple of months ago.
Find me on there, and I put my material up there. And it'd be great to hear from any of your listeners who are interested in these topics.
Okay, wonderful. Yeah, we'll link that up in the show notes for anybody who wants to follow along. Trevor does post pretty regularly there, and what kickstarted this interview was this fantastic article that he wrote a couple of months ago while the trial was still going on. So a lot to see, a lot to read, a lot more to learn about this amazing trial.
The other last thing is that I have been invited by the world famous Cambridge Intelligence Seminar to give a talk about the Bulgarian spy ring later in the year. So that will be really, really interesting. Look forward to that.
So cool, Trevor. Well, congratulations on that. And thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate you sharing all this with us today.
It's a pleasure, and always a pleasure to talk to you, Justin, and communicate with your wonderful listeners.
Well, thank you so much. Take care.
Yeah, so to you. Bye.
If you're interested in more of Spycraft 101, look for my page on Instagram at Spycraft 101. You can also find more great articles on my website, spycraft101.com. Thank you all for listening, and I hope you'll stick around because there's lots more to come.
Disclaimer. This podcast is for entertainment purposes only. The stories and statements expressed herein are experiences and opinions. They may not reflect the views of the host or the production studio. It's okay if you disagree with our content. No piece of media is right for everyone. If you love Spycraft 101, please check us out online, on Instagram, on YouTube, and especially on Patreon. Thank you for listening.